Welcome to our 10th official CAN. We've actually had 12 this year, but the other two were special and they weren't scheduled. Today's is about crafting a recommendation letter that shines. Thank you for joining us. It's actually the last CAN of the year, but all right, that's cool. There's going to be tons of topics next year, so we'll come up with some other hot ones. And if you've got some ideas, you can always let us know in the chat. Just a quick reminder that the biggest thing is please make your name and your organization. That helps us so much with the attendance. We love that you're here. We'll acknowledge that we've got this many people, but it's so helpful to know where folks are coming from. It's the kind of thing the folks that fund us love to know. So we want to let them know what they love to know, right? And if you can, show your camera, that's great too, because it's so cool to have a conversation with not a black box. So that's really good too. So again, the objectives of the day, I'll let Craig talk more about this, but there was a little seed of an idea about recommendations in the climate of the day, a little seed about how important they are and how to best write them. And then we emailed a little and Craig said he would do it. And now we're going to talk about recommendations. And I think it's going to be great. So I think that's all. Nothing official to say, except thank you so much, Craig, for joining us. And I'll let you share your screen if that's okay.
Yes, of course. Thanks, Sandy, and I'm happy to be on here today. I see a lot of familiar faces. I want to make sure we have some good time for a bit more discussion about where letters of recommendation can make a difference and an impact for students who are in need of it, but also what we're in need for the college side in order to get the students to where they need to be. Ideally, because of the world that we live in now has it seems like more restrictions or more powers that are trying to take control over the world of college admissions, whatever we want to look at and however we want to look at it. There are ways to still make sure we as a collective group can do our part to make sure students are on the right path, and keeping this sort of ship going. But I'm going to share, and I'll introduce for those of you who I don't know yet, who I am. I'm Craig Broccoli. I'm the Associate Director of Admissions for Binghamton University, which part of the State University of New York, or SUNY. I am based in New York City. I have been in New York City for the last, I think this is 11 years, 14 years in admissions. My experience comes, yes, from the selective public side. This base of this presentation I'm going to share actually with just some tips about the letter of recommendation was built in conjunction with colleagues many of you may know, Erica Padilla with University of Rochester. There's an influence that it's not just, oh, this is what the public schools are looking at. This is more so a broader scope of what a letter of recommendation should be and how it should work, but also now more so in the world we live in where it can be even more powerful than ever before. So yes, of course, I want to make sure that we have time for questions, particularly around ways to do things better, but also just in general, what's going on in the world of admissions with these other aspects, these other additional pieces beyond just the student's academic record and their written essay for that matter. But how do they all come together? So in general, the letter of recommendation, you know where it fits in, but I want to sort of tuck in the other aspects of the letter of recommendation for the admissions committee. When colleges start, I think it's worth knowing and reminding ourselves that this is one piece, the letter of recommendation. It could carry a lot of weight. And I say could because there are times when the admissions team wants the letter of recommendation to be more influential for one student than it might have been for another student. And I'm saying that in the context of that's what holistic review means. Not every single aspect carries the same weight. Yes, the academics are always going to be the biggest for the vast majority of colleges, but the letter of recommendation could add a level of influence to the file over time. And I'll talk about what the over time part means, because many students are being reviewed more than once, but over time of the application cycle, the letter of recommendation may resurface again as a point of influence. And I'll try to make mention of that in just a bit. But in general, the college committees, we all have different setups. We're going to try to advocate for the student. We're trying to find ways to admit a student. But over the timeline, all the spots are open in the early rounds. There tends to be a little bit more of a focus of, this is a traditionally good admit student. Let's try to advocate for admissions early on, if it's, say, an early action school versus, say, or an early decision process versus, say, later on in the process, maybe a regular decision applicant, excluding opportunity programs. That's a different process. Earlier on in the process, all these things carry similar weight. They add value. There are going to be things that come up over time, institutional priorities, things that colleges may find out about mid-cycle. We need more, and this happened. It happened at Binghamton a couple of years back. More computer science students. There's 100 spots that just got added. We were then looking into letters of rec, students beyond just what a student told us they wanted. We started going back into certain student files, looking for tips and indications that this could be a good student to fill these institutional priorities that came up. Now, the value, I mean, I'm stating the obvious again, of the letter of recommendation is to give us something that we don't already know. There's space to certainly restate things that need to be restated, maybe how extraordinary the student is in a particular high school class of that year. Yes, of course, that is stating something we might already know by the academic record, but it's to help introduce things that we don't always see. That's going to be important in a moment, just because of the context of where we live, where we don't see race and ethnicity data anymore. We do not really get a fuller context of the school as much. A lot of information could be blocked out in the application review. The letter of recommendation is a free form, right? You can put in what you think is important. And I know a lot of you have some good experience. You know what's important. We'll talk about that. But this is an opportunity to add information that you really think we need to know. And I'll be broader than just, of course, Binghamton. A student applies to a school in the Midwest who might not know your school very well, or your organization very well. They need to know the information that, I might already know at Binghamton. So your letter of rec obviously is not just written to the schools that know you and your students, it's written to the schools that don't. And if it's redundancy for someone like me, that's not a problem. But it's important to make sure schools know what's going on. But this, of course, could come from a variety of forms, sometimes in tandem, right? You might be writing as an advisor, a college advisor, a counselor. There might be a teacher letter of rec that is also sharing context that we need to know. And it'd be nice if you could see all of those, but it can come in a variety of forms. We'll piece them together. Certainly on the counselor side, it's going to go deeper into the context of the class. This is where I think it's most important to introduce things like cultural, family backgrounds, demographic information, where a student is in context. Certainly, if a student is talking about their race or their cultural background as an identity factor in their essay, I'm trying to encourage students to feel more comfortable with that and how it impacts their life. It may not come across as a comfort level in communication for students. So the counselor letter of rec could offer that insight. This would be an opportunity, I think, maybe to do it in a way where the student isn't under pressure to do so, but also in a way that helps not just introduce a student's background, but talk about the background, how that influenced the student and their growth and their future growth, who that student might be on a college campus. Maybe they're coming from a school where the vast majority of students identify as students of color. Sure, they're not going to stand out in the context of their high school there, But what's that mean for the future student and where they're looking to go? What are some of their goals, their visions, and how they see their identity shaping their future? That's an opportunity. The counselor of rec, sometimes the teacher letter of rec can also do that. Those are some things to think about. The difference maker, not every letter of rec is going to carry a whole bunch of weight. What I mean by that is the students who are clearly admissible, yeah, the letter of rec is going to be used as an opportunity to make sure we're not missing something, maybe more of that context of where the student fits into the world, where maybe something they have overcome that we didn't get to see elsewhere. Maybe a red flag. There could be a red flag that we're seeing the counselor rec, which is important. That can come up. That would be a difference maker. Maybe there's something we need to look into a little deeper. But really, where they make a difference is for the extraordinary student cases, where this is an outlier, a top 3% type student that you've seen over the years. It will not change the status if the student's not academically admissible. Not going to make them academically admissible. And I would hate to have any of you think there's pressure on that, right? That's not what you need to think about when writing a letter of rec. It's not changing the scope of the type of school the student should be going to. But it should really help the admissions team feel like they have enough to make the decision. Um, at the very least, create for a student who might need more additional help, maybe a follow-up phone call or an email exchange. It gives the platform to inquire for more. Um, so the clear endorsement piece, I will get to that in some brief examples. There's definitely space for that, even if it feels repetitive on your end, and I get it. You might be writing for a few students, more than a few, that are really outstanding, and it feels like, well, if I keep writing this, it's going to take away from the other student. It's not. Um, as long as the same exact letter being, printed out, pushed along, there's room for that clear endorsement for multiple students. Yeah, are they read? Um, generally speaking, yes. I say that generally. We're all reading them. How they're read, how quickly they're read, how in depth they're read, how many times they're read. That part will vary. There are. I will explain here. The past 2 years, there have been a series of times where I've read a letter of recommendation or recommendation letters, because I would have read multiple for the same student, um, at least 3 times at different points in the cycle. A student applied early action. They were looked at as a good student but deferred. We moved them off to regular. A follow-up review happened in regular decision, and the student was read. Their letter of recommendation was now, more so skimmed because there were some notes in there. But then a third round review came about in terms of making sure we understand students and their context. Uh, this happened for Binghamton. About 8,000 students were reread in the sense of making sure we're understanding the student's background, where they're coming from. That record, the student's file was read 3 times. The recommendation was read 3 times, and that's at a big public with 60,000 applications. Right? And this happens time and time again. Now, the formats that work, again, I know a lot of you have your formats down. Some of you might not yet, or maybe some of you want to just rework it. There's not a perfect style. I mean, the perfect style is the one that you feel most comfortable just putting out there. I think the long narratives, I don't think the ones of you I know that's not your style. There's somewhere I get 3 pages. It depends on the school, it depends on the caseload for sure. Definitely not necessary. I can understand in some cases where it would be necessary for a student that really needs the context explained. But again, that could be a follow-up phone call versus, say, a letter of rec. The narrative with examples, I think, is really effective, or even narrative, like a broader explanation of the student and context of the school, with added examples if you want to, if you know a teacher, if you know somebody else who can talk about the student in a snippet, adding that snippet in, that quote, the bullet point is actually a really effective tool to putting together a comprehensive letter of recommendation. Not necessary, but helps sometimes when you have added, insight into one letter of rec. And I say that because there are some bigger publics, there are some institutions that require one letter, and they only look at one letter. They only receive one letter. So sometimes, there's that student who might have three other good letters of rec from a teacher. They're not getting that into the uh, the college's view plane because it just wasn't there. That's not the case for Binghamton, even though we require one. We'll see all that come through, but there are some big publics that might not see all of them. That's where that counselor letter of rec could add in just a quick little snippet of what a teacher may have said in a particular class, if you think it's important. The bulleted format, I've been saying this since really 2020. This is a good way to go. It's not by any means meant to restrict what you want to write. Some of you really enjoy writing and are brilliant writers, and go ahead. Some of you maybe don't love that idea, and the bulleted aspect, I think, universally can help us read through quickly to see what the key points are, but giving room for anything else that you think needs to be explained. Um, the quick don'ts, again, I don't want to, state too much of the obvious here, but we don't need a redo of the school profile. If there's a big update in the profile, that's a do. You can update that. You can give us a little reminder. Hey, in our profile, we say this. Those are things that are helpful. The overly generic language. I mean, look, I get it. There are times when there's a student you barely know. While that's a don't, sometimes that's the only thing you can do. But the overly generic language is not necessarily helping here. The we can use AI to help write letters of rec too, like, or help, format sentences and so forth. It's just making sure things are repersonalized for a student, pronouns in particular, if that's part of it. It's just, it doesn't bother me per se, but you never know who else is reading a letter of rec, and they're going through and they're noticing some inconsistencies. The overly gratuitous praise, particularly without evidence, is a problem. Certainly, there are students who are phenomenal. Let's provide a little bit of evidence, though, to back that up. Again, this goes more so maybe for the school who doesn't know you. More superlatives aren't always better. Again, that goes back to the overly gratuitous praise there. Focusing on challenges without outcomes. This is what we tell students, right? When they write their essay, make sure that the outcome is there, not just the challenge. Just wanted to put that out there. And I'll be clear, I think teachers and counselors and advisors, you may have more of the responsibility to talk about what the challenge is. Whatever that might be, what the student's economic situation, their family situation, their upbringing, something they're dealing with, a health situation. Yeah, that's the weight that you might be bearing, because you got to talk about that, because the student's not going to talk about it, or maybe don't feel comfortable talking about it. But we still are looking for room for what's happening now, or maybe what's your advice, or your advice to the colleges. Like, hey, this student's really recovering from this. The student's really growing from this. Your synopsis on what you think might happen in the future, what the student might need. That's where I'm talking about context to the challenge could help. And of course, you don't have to write 3 pages. More is not always better. Strong paragraphs in the beginning, getting us to understand what's happening, who the student is, the context, great. There's an example I'll show a little bit about ways to really convey who a student is in the context. Anytime your school you feel like needs a nuance described of the curriculum, do it. Or a teacher, this is more important for the teacher side. Or maybe that the math teacher at the student's high school is tough, real tough. And that's the snippet you used. If you wanted to use a snippet, maybe put that context in, right? This is a school class where students don't normally score well, in general. That could help with the nuance there. Any examples or anecdotes? I mean, these are the memorable parts of a letter of rec. Those are helpful too, if you have it. The follow-up idea, I like understanding that there's an open line of dialogue and communication between the admission side and the counseling side, or even the teacher side. It might not always get caught there, where at the bottom of the application or the recommendation letter it says, yeah, please call me. If there's scenarios like that, you can just send an email. Hey, just want to make sure you got my letter of rec. Here it is. If there's a scenario where you think there more needs to be discussed. But generally, yes. Like I mentioned earlier, if we're reading an application a couple times, particularly the student who's on the bubble, maybe there is some question marks we have. That's probably the type of student we want to talk a little bit more about. And if your letter of recommendation is indicating, hey, I'm really open to talking some more about this, great. We'll talk more. Maybe it's just something easier to talk about over the phone, or a health concern, or something that it's just easier to talk that way. That happens for me a small percentage of the time. Maybe a little bit more. Some of you know this with an opportunity program and review, EOP, HEOP, I would imagine a lot more. There are some real key points that we're looking for in a letter of recommendation for the opportunity program reviews, where we might want to talk a little bit more, or you might have more to share, especially over time, how senior year is progressing. Your letter of rec might have been about what happened at the end of junior year, but now more context exists. We can talk more about that. All right. Now, the unconscious bias aspect here, I know we all kind of know what this might mean, but writing a letter of rec, I think particularly now, we want to make sure that we're advocating for a student. We want to make sure we're describing who the student is, where they're coming from, particularly where we think it could help. But we also want to avoid the generalization aspects too, particularly when it comes down to like racial or socioeconomic generalizations or biases you might see in society. I think we all know our students. We all want to make sure we're advocating for the student. We can talk generally about a student, their identity, their background, but then get specific to where that student is, again, growing or overcoming a challenge. And I know down at the bottom, the pandemic, that for these students is not a huge factor, but there are a lot of things happening that aren't, quote, a pandemic, but what is happening now and how that student is viewing the college experience, particularly based on maybe their upbringing, their background, their status in the world right now, and how they might feel. There's room for that in a letter of recommendation that gives a helpful piece to us on the admission side to understand how the student will fit our class. Now, the overcoming challenges, like in the high school in New York City curriculum, the context of where your students are, again, may be common knowledge to the publics and private schools in New York who know your students well, but might not be as common and public and common knowledge to a place outside of here, particularly to admissions counselors who might not have the full context. I know often it's the case that the admissions team assigns a person who knows your region really well, or knows the school, or knows, the borough for that matter. That's not always the case. The turnover in admissions is crazy. It's insane. A lot of new faces, new minds coming in. They don't always know the context. And that's where overcoming challenges and the experiences in New York City is important to hash out and put in there. the future path, down at the bottom, I think is usually most important. I look for that. What are you saying? Where is this student going? Maybe the student's talking about how they want to be an engineer, but they're a great liberal arts student. They're probably going to change their mind in college, and they'll probably belong at in a liberal arts environment, whether that's a public school that offers it or a small private. But you're giving sort of your recommendation in the context of how you see this student growing. I think that's great. Um, Now, the changing landscape, obviously with SCOTUS decision, um, we don't see a lot of information that we used to see. We do not see students' racial, ethnic data information. We do not see that not just in their application, but we don't see it in any other form or context. Things coming from landscape, which is a college board aspect, we don't see any of that. What we also are starting to notice, and I've noticed this for now a couple of years, students are maybe more hesitant to even talk about it, about their racial, ethnic background, where they see their identity coming into play. It's not always an obvious thing. A student may indicate involvement in clubs and organizations that could, hint at that, but it doesn't necessarily, give a conviction of who the student is, how they identify, and where they think their identity has shaped them. That's the key part. I think the letter of recommendation might be one of the better areas to do this. And of course, a student essay could be a good opportunity for students to talk about their identity. The letter of recommendation could echo that. But how their identity has shaped their academic experience is the goal here. That's the piece that we can use more in the admission side when we're recommending a student to the rest of our committee or to our, our next level decision makers for the incoming class. I will say it's important. Colleges care about the diversity of their student body. I know I'm generalizing, but the majority do. They want to keep the diversity they have, and in many cases augment that. There are harder ways to do that this year than ever before, and last year the same. There are ways I think the letter of recommendation can help. We are looking for the reasons to advocate for the student, to push the student, in my case, that I think needs another review, to a committee review. That might be 5%. It's not, I don't know the exact number, but a very small majority of the students in a big public will go to a committee review. But I'm trying to find the nuggets that will help me push a student to committee review so we can do a deeper dive with multiple admissions counselors. Okay. These are just some sample questions to think about. It helps kind of get started. This is more, if you want to share this later with anybody else who's on your team who might be new to writing letter recommendations, or maybe there's a question in here you think could help based off letters you've written in the past. But it really comes down to, these are good starters. Like what are things you want to indicate, or concluding pieces, paragraphs? What will you remember most about this person? Always like that piece, but it gives you a sense of who the student was legacy wise within the school. Of course, any unique features, think about that. What is this student like uniquely good at? I get it. This is not always going to be an easy thing. Some students, they're very similar to each other, and they're frankly trying to be similar to each other. So it's harder to distinguish these aspects. But you can talk about that in context of maybe your years of working at a particular organization. That could help. It doesn't always have to be within the context of their current class. It could be over a longer length of time. Has the student taken an intellectual risk, or have they taken a personal risk, like within their school, and how they, changed and grown over time? There's a lot of space to think about the unique factors of a student and have that be the intro or concluding piece, and in the body of the recommendation letter talk about the facts that we just need to know. Here's just some examples. We can read through them, or you can skim them. Oh, I didn't want to do that. There are ways to describe a student, I think this goes into that don't use overly gratuitous praise. I like that bottom one about Lupe Rodriguez is a Renaissance woman, creative, inventive. It just makes you want to read this a little bit deeper. Um, it's not saying necessarily this is the best student I've ever seen, which could be the case. You can do that. If you do it for 12 students, it's not going to help, particularly if I'm the one who reads it. But there's ways to really describe a student and also, not have to get too detailed about what it is that makes that student great. It's a captivating way of looking at this. Now, this is more so for the teacher letter of rec, how a student has grown in their classroom, or in that class. That as a counselor letter of rec, you could indicate, yeah, this student jumped from a lower level math to a higher level math, which was a surprise because the student didn't do so well early on, but they had made incredible strides. Those are important factors to think about there. Now, I want to get into the questions, but there was a couple more samples. I'm going to leave this up for a second. And if we could all read this. All right, and I'm going to also put this one up. And let's just read this. Okay. What's the bigger difference between these two? Or at least what do you think the bigger difference is? I know nobody wants to unmute. And I get it. These are coming from the teacher side, so I'm not trying to say this is how a counselor letter of rec necessarily would be. But they're not, I mean, obviously there's not the formatting that you would look for in a college recommendation. Oh, I see the chat has some options in here. Yes. Yes, Beth. I mean, the second one is much more about who the student is, context, and it's not going too deep into it. You don't have to. Just adding that bit of, say, flavor, where even if the student is not somebody you know super, super well, there are ways to like make sure that the reader is thinking about the things that they should be thinking about. Obviously, if I'm reading a student from rural Arkansas, a high school in rural Arkansas, I should have that in the back of my mind. But you want to make sure the reader knows, hey, this is the difference here. This is a student who actually stands out a lot compared to students I've seen in the past. Um, it could flip that to say New York City. In New York City, in this high school, all the students identify as students of color, but this is a student who is looking at their identity as saying how they want to shape the future for themselves and their family by being the first to go to college. And what I know I'm making up some examples on the fly here, but you're adding that context into what their academic and everything else could be. Okay. What are we thinking about in terms of some questions and be in this case, I would say open to the things that you're worried about, ways to tweak things. It could be about trends that we're seeing, colleges, and how we're utilizing that. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second and come back to that if we need to go back to examples. But what are some things that we're worried about? Or on the other side, problems that you're having with writing letters of rec that you want admissions to talk through with you. And I'll pull up the chat so I don't miss that too. But if you're in a space you want to unmute and ask, go ahead.
This is a great opportunity, guys, to talk right to an admissions officer and hear about recommendation letters.
Okay, I'll ask a question.
Thanks, Amy.
Hi, Craig.
Hello, Amy.
So my question is, what about the kid who like hasn't found the cure for cancer? You know, like just the everyday kid who is a really good kid, and you know, you work at a CBO, so you see a different side of them, but they're just like a normal kid, like most of us probably were. And how do you make that kid shine without, you know, lying or exaggerating, but know that that kid would definitely get hit, you know, get to school and would be um, would contribute to the school, but maybe wouldn't be running for student president of a college kind of thing. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
So the
I
middle of
don't.
the road kid that maybe just gets overlooked.
Yeah, that's actually a good chunk of the students, right, that are out
Right,
there.
right.
And this is where honesty helps, right? And like just even saying that, this is a student who's going to be a team player. This is not necessarily your next starting 15 clubs on that college campus. Having that honest sort of intro to a student or somewhere in there is actually a quite helpful thing. I'm thinking on behalf of a school like Binghamton, we need students like that. I would argue all schools need students like that. Now, certainly, yeah, the super, super, super selective institutions are looking for the diamonds that, that they are trying to uncover. That student, while they may have a chance to get in there, you could probably understand, like, no matter what you write in the letter of rec is not changing their trajectory there. I do think that doesn't come across as fluff if you indicate, hey, this is a student that's really just trying to figure it out. They don't know what their passions are yet. They don't necessarily know what they're going to do on a college campus. But I can tell you they really fit into wherever group they fit into, whatever that might, maybe they're meeting with you and you could tell from what they're talking about based on their high school experience that they're really malleable. Like talking about that, those are the students that, in terms of retention on our college campuses, we like those students because we know they're going to get there and they're going to find their fit somewhere. Sometimes the students who want to go start all the clubs and organizations, they're there, and then when they realize they can't do it, they leave. They're the transferring out students. So I think there's room to talk about how you see that student growing. um, I would say let's put this in the context of an opportunity program. Um, I know you and I have spoken about this, but I think there's room in letters or recommendation to talk about students who are going to seek out help. Um, if they're going to see someone like you, they're somewhat seeking out help. If it's an opportunity program student, we want to know the students who are going to leverage the resources of the office. That's a huge indicator of retention, graduation rate, just the fact that they're going to be successful, particularly students who are maybe at an academic lower bar than where we're traditionally admitting students, who they're at a risk of maybe falling to the wayside. But if you can talk about sort of where they're starting to notice how they can seek out help, that would be helpful.
Okay, that's good. That's a lot.
All right, I see a couple that popped in to the chat. The question is, if you don't know a student well, do you advise that a generic letter be written, or can a counselor opt out of writing one? You can opt out of writing one, counselors. I know that sounds like maybe a cop out, like, hey, or you can write, look, this student, I have a bunch of students that I'm working with right now, came to me last minute. I understand they need help. I get this. It doesn't look like it's putting the student in the best light, but at least it's explaining what's happening. That's not a bad look. We get this. there are a lot of changing, things happening for a student in senior year. They might be really not getting their act together. You indicating that in a way that it's not, telling us that the student didn't get their act together, but hey, look, this is what I have right now on this student. Um, follow up if you have more questions, but that's fine. It at least allows us to understand, okay, the student's kind of clicking into gear late. There's another scenario, as you're kind of indicating here. And a generic letter is just would be essentially a placeholder anyway. I'm more under the advising of use your time wisely. I know you can't write a letter of rec for every single student in a way that, pushes them beyond what they normally would get. And here's kind of the key. The letter of recommendation rarely will be that influential. It is influential in the standpoint of the student who needs the help, but the student who's kind of just doing fine, they're going to do well in the college level, and you don't have a lot of context to add, that is completely fine. If you need to opt out or not, if as long as if it's a required letter of rec at some point, a teacher rec is coming in, um, that's how that would work. I would say even a lot of schools right now who require a letter of rec, it's not a point that stops the student from moving along in the admissions process. So their file actually still would be complete. I know some of the SUNYs operate that way, definitely the CUNYs. Their application is actually complete, so they can still be reviewed even without the letter of rec. The question about do short and nondescript teachers letters negatively impact a student's application? Rarely will it negatively impact a student's application. I'm thinking about a couple times in the committee review, which, to be fair, there's usually enough experienced admissions counselors in committee review where we encourage even the most ambitious newer counselors to avoid assuming too much, right? You can assume if the teacher rec is nondescript and not super helpful, that maybe the student's not a great student in that chemistry class. That's a bad assumption. The other assumption could be made, this teacher is just not a good writer. The other assumption that could be made is that the student, there was 150 students who asked for that teacher's letter of rec. We don't use that usually as a negative piece. I would put it under the category of a missed opportunity. With that said, the letter of rec missed opportunity is less impactful than a student's essay being a missed opportunity, right? If a student decided to kind of not put together a strong essay, while they still might be admissible and be fine, it could be a missed opportunity, maybe being looked at for a scholarship program or a research program. The letter of rec is not usually in that category of influence. Oh, yes, and Tara, that's yeah. I want to make sure that we're thinking about where we can be open and honest and helpful for students versus the category of playing it safe. Let me just be clear, like, even on a recorded aspect here, we'll use what we can use. And we're using that in a shape of like understanding who is a student, why we think they might be a good student on our college campus, in context to everything else we already have, and that we're going to have their academic record, and likely an evolving academic record. Whether they send test scores or not, we have additional pieces to look at academically speaking for a student. We're going to know all of that. What we don't know is, how a student is growing necessarily. We don't know who the student is. Most schools don't offer interviews anymore, or at least they're not interviews that are super present. The letter of recommendation could help. There's a piece here, and I'm just going to throw it out there. It's unrelated, and I see the other question that came through. There are more and more colleges using video platforms, things like Glimpse. Some schools have their own platform where a student can say who they are, talk about something they're interested in. That is, another thing to think about in the context of what we're saying of how to understand who a student is. Maybe their essay doesn't do it. Maybe their letter of rec doesn't have a space for it, or just wasn't done in that case. Maybe their extracurriculars aren't talking about it. But a student could do that in a video platform, a minute or a minute and a half video, where they might feel that that would help. Oh, you know what? Let me go back to a different view because I can't see who has hands up.
You
There we go.
also, hey Craig, you also have a hand raised. Beth Garcia has been waiting for a while.
All right, Beth, sorry, I didn't see that was up.
Thank you. It's okay. Just to further contribute to Amy's question about a student that isn't the CEO of anywhere in particular, I would suggest, pardon me, to point out, like in the, or to utilize the DISC personality assessments or anything similar to that, to point out the more anchoring styles in a group, pardon me, that are not the leader. For example, in DISC, you have the conscientious category. I'm so sorry. And that student, their positives are being analytical, precise, and systematic. And then you have the steady personality, which is just an ideal team player. So even though you don't, you can't always say that a student is going to be your next best Pulitzer Prize winner on a campus, they are going to support the team that will lead to that. So that's all I wanted to say.
Beth, I appreciate you sharing that. And then, yes, there are good ways to think about the non-leader student in a good way, where who they are, how they're going to contribute, and you might see that better than anybody. Meaning you see how the student's interacting in the school. We don't know that. We don't know anything other than what's on paper. And typically that's a student who's not going to email the admissions office a handful of times. That's not the student who is going to have a brag sheet in their essay. Not that that's a good thing, but what I'm going at is, like, that's a student who's also probably not self-advocating a lot. And that's maybe something to say. Hey, look, I know this is not a student who's going to knock down your door to tell you how great they are, but let me tell you how great they are with their classmates and their team. And, and this is what the track coach has said. Those are things that could help. The question about extracurriculars, actually, I think this is a really good thing to think about. Students actually struggle when they ask me, like, what can I talk about in extracurriculars that are important? But in the framing of how the Common App has it, where you have a sentence to write about it, but it's a really super important thing for them, or a couple things are really important. I think there's room in the letter of recommendation to talk about what that extracurricular might mean to the student, their responsibility with it. Maybe it is to go to the leader type student. This is something that the student started. The high school really needed this, and this student found the will and they rallied up a bunch of other students to start that club or organization. Yes, that would be awesome for a counselor or a teacher even to talk about that. Or just the extracurriculars that don't seem like the student doesn't seem comfortable talking about it, like taking care of a bunch of siblings, or an elderly family member. Sometimes a student will list it as hours that they spend, but you have more insight to help us understand what that really means to the students' time and the burdens it may have, also the opportunities of growth it may have. I think, yes, you can certainly go into detail or talk about things that are already listed. That is not redundancy in my point of view. That's actually just helpful context, and you're using what you already now know about the student. I hope most of you get a good list from your students about what they're doing, what their involvements are, so you have stuff to go off of. please definitely ask for that. And that's fine if you're kind of telling us more about those particular subject matters related to a student. In fact, that might it's due diligence and it's true justice if you're picking one of the extracurriculars that's really important to the student, or really, maybe not taking up the most time, but it's something that's made the biggest impact on their lives. Great, let's hear about that from your point of view. And I know I mentioned this earlier and a couple times, particularly about opportunity programs. I think that is where letters of recommendation have been used more and more powerfully over the years. There are generally more students that are eligible for these opportunity programs than ever before, or at least applying towards them. Not necessarily more spots, though some programs have expanded, or colleges have added additional avenues as opportunity programs. The letter of recommendation could be a point where we can talk more about that. Or here's an example. This student, while may not financially be eligible for an opportunity program, family-wise is quite close, quite close to the financial bar, and would really benefit from the additional resources of an opportunity program. That's a good trigger for the HEOP programs, but it's also a trigger for the public schools who are adding new school-funded opportunity programs that are different than, say, EOP, or different than TRIO. Could give an opportunity to help identify students. So feel free to talk about that in a letter of rec where you see it. I know the financial income bars are quite strict for opportunity programs, but this could give some insight to where a student may benefit from some new programs that you might not even know exists, but you did your due diligence by putting it out there. I'm just making sure I didn't miss anything. If I missed a question, definitely ask it again or type it up so I didn't see it. And I know some of you are either going to New York City CAC's, the conference, or you might already be there. I'll be up there later, so I'll see you there. If you have questions, you want to follow up in person, that works well too.
It looks like Serena has a question. Also, while you're asking your question, Serena, I'm going to put up our poll for our evaluation because people are starting to leave, and I want to make sure folks do our evaluation. Do not leave.
Do
Do
the
not
eval.
leave. Serena, go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. So my question was in the chat and might be a little redundant at this point, but I teach at an art school. So my question was really to how do I highlight or express some of the glows for those students that are academically middle of the road or struggling, but they sing, they dance, they act, and they're great community members. How does it read on your end, but also how would I highlight those things?
So I think just simply saying that, and obviously you don't want to detract from, like, maybe you don't want to talk about the things that the student doesn't excel in, but you do want to talk about where they excel, how they fit the community, particularly I think the arts community at large. I'll give an example from a Binghamton perspective in just a moment. That's something that's harder to always assess. And the admissions team might not be the best assessor of that, but we do make referrals. We might say, hey, this could be a student that while they're not applying for musical theater, we let our departments know, or we might reach out to the student because of what we see indicated there and say, hey, would you like to do an audition, or would you like to provide a portfolio? The example I'm giving here is years ago, we at Binghamton used to ask students to provide, a portfolio if they wanted to, even if they weren't looking for that as their major, music, performing arts, any of the fine and studio arts, they could provide a portfolio. We do not do that anymore because we have a BFA program that requires that for that. Therefore, where we are noticing, like that's something that I like to see, that a counselor can talk about that, particularly arts that might not pop off the page. You can talk about that in the letter of rec, and what that might mean to the student. That's important, like how that's shaped their lives, but also how you see that maybe shaping their future college experience. This is the student who's going to join the student run theater program, maybe not, auditioning for the main stage, but they're going to be that type of student. That's a good sort of, hey, this is how I see the student growing. It helps us understand how that student fits our community. I think those are important pieces that you might not think about because they're different than the academics, but still necessary. Oh, yes. And then if anybody has future questions about something I said here or just in general, I'm going to put my email down at the bottom too. I think it's in the slideshow. And as I mentioned, I'll give some credit here, of course, too, to Erica Padilla, University of Rochester, has shaped some of the talking points in there too. You may see her out there. She's a great person to ask about letters of rec, and maybe in the context of how it fits a school like Rochester. But it's largely the same insight there. I just wanted to add more about the context of the world we live in now.
Thank you so much, Craig. Thank you so much also for leaving so much time for questions and answers. That was extremely valuable to be able to spend time talking with you about that. And thank you for bringing in also Erica's viewpoint into this.
Of
Thanks.
course. Yes. See you all out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks everyone for contributing as well.
Bye, everybody.
Bye now.